Well, just for the purpose of the webcast, it's Wednesday, the 15th of January 2020. This is our first live webcast of the year. And this evening, I'm going to be talking on living freely and lightly. This is actually, it starts off in a passage in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament, which it's probably a well-known story, but a number of years ago, I heard this story explained in a slightly different way, and I knew it was for me. I was sitting in a conference. I was actually in a conference over in Toronto. I was sitting at the back of the hall. There are about 2,500 people there. And Ken Gott from the northeast of England was speaking, and he spoke about this story from the book of Joshua. And as he explained it and brought revelation, I knew that this story, or the impact of this story, was for me, and that the Father wanted to do something deep in my heart. And I knew that it was all about me losing my dad when I'd been a 10-year-old boy. And as Ken Gott was speaking, I knew what the Father wanted to do was bring complete freedom and healing to my heart. My dad had died 30 years before this. But I knew that tonight was the night, or that night was the night. And that the Father wanted to bring some really deep healing to my heart. And at the end of that meeting, I was going to go up for the ministry time, but I just couldn't move out of my seat. I was stuck in my seat, and I was just crying. And sitting next to me was an 18-year-old guy who was part of the ministry team. And he didn't actually go up to the front and join in with all the ministry there and all the fun that was going on at the front of the conference. He just stayed sitting next to me, and he put his arm around me, and he didn't say a word for 20 minutes. And at the end of those 20 minutes, I stopped crying, and I just looked at him and said, "Thank you." And he said, something like, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." And I knew that at the end of that 20 minutes, my heart had been healed. You see, I can put words to it now, but for those 30 years, I couldn't really put words to it, but I felt restricted. I felt held back. I felt like there was a chain around my ankle, and the other end of it was attached to a stake that was, embedded into the ground. And however hard I wanted to move on, or however much I wanted to be free, it was always like I was stuck. And I knew that night, it was actually in May 2002, I know that on that night that the chain was taken off my foot, so to speak, and I was free. And I knew at the end of those 20 minutes that something really deep had happened, and I can honestly say that since that time, my life has not been the same. It really set me free to live in a completely different way. And, I wish, I wish we could have an encounter with the Father and have everything sorted out and dealt with in 20 minutes. But you and I know that it's very often not the case. Sometimes it happens in 20 minutes, sometimes it happens in 20 seconds, and other times we can walk through this process and it can take years. And, I wish it would happen quickly for everyone, but very often it's something that takes time. And my encouragement is really just to give yourself to that process and stay in the process until you know that you are free. There's been other occasions in my life when I've kind of looked back and thought, I know I'm going to be free of this in 5 minutes. And, maybe it's 5 months later, you think, now I'm feeling different. And we can never put a time scale on what Father wants to do. We can always hope that it will be quick, but sometimes it's just not that way. And it's It's easy to lose heart. It's natural to become discouraged. But I want to encourage you just to hang in there and go with what Father's doing, because as He leads us, He's always leading us towards freedom, and that's what He wants for us. He wants us to be free, and the freer we get, the more we'll really be able to live as sons and daughters. And that's what it's all about. It's people often talk about this revelation of the Father as being something that is really limited, if you like, to our hearts being healed. And once our hearts have been healed, we're then free to get on and do again, and get on and be busy and just carry on life as we were carrying on. But I've really come to see that this journey with the Father is all about living in love. It's making love our greatest aim. It's allowing the Father to continually pour His love into our hearts. It's allowing ourselves to be soaked in love and being held in our Father's embrace. And as we live in love, as we begin to walk as Jesus walked, as we live in that place of security and love, it is inevitable that our hearts will be healed. It's just an inevitable consequence of walking with Father. So, what I'm trying to do nowadays is not look for my heart to be healed, but look to how I can allow God to be a Father to me. Look to how I can really walk in love. Because I know from my experience that the more I walk in love, the more I allow God to be a Father to me, the more my heart will be inevitably healed. I think that the danger is we want our heart, of course we want our hearts healed, but if we focus on that, then once we've received a measure of healing, and of course the Father does heal our hearts, and if we come to Him with a broken heart, He will heal it. But if we focus on that, the moment we feel that our heart has been healed will be the moment that we get back into the track of busyness and doing things and losing sight of the ultimate goal of walking as Jesus walked in sonship and allowing God to be a Father to us. So that's kind of the background. And I just want to refer, we're not going to read the story in Joshua, but I'm going to refer to it and just explain the story. But it's and you may want to read it yourself later, but it's Joshua chapter 10 and the first 28 verses. And what is going on here is the nations that are friendly with Joshua are being attacked by 5 enemy armies. And so these nations that are friendly with Joshua, they come to him because they recognize he's got good leadership, he's got a good army. And they come to Joshua and they ask him to sort of join together with them against these 5 enemy armies. And so Joshua does, and Joshua leads his armies into battle against these 5 enemy armies. And he pursues them and he defeats them. And the nations that have come to Joshua for help and protection, they receive that help and they receive that protection. And, after the battle, they know they've won the war. But what happens along the way is Joshua is pursuing the enemy, but the kings, the 5 enemy kings, are cowardly. And they leave their armies to fight Joshua. And they leave the armies to go into battle and basically get annihilated. But the kings are cowards. And what the kings do is they go into a cave and they hide from Joshua. And Joshua is made aware that this is what's happened. Some people come to Joshua and say, the kings have gone into a cave and they're hiding. Now, Joshua doesn't panic or change his plan or change his strategy, but what he does is he very simply has a big stone rolled over the entrance to the cave. So the enemy kings are trapped inside the cave. And he carries on and he defeats the armies, and he has victory. But what he does then is he comes back to the cave, he rolls the stone away, and he brings the kings out of the cave. And at that point in time, he kills the 5 enemy kings. And when Ken Gott was speaking about this in Toronto in May 2002, he spoke very powerfully out of a story in his own life where he and his wife had lost a baby child. Their baby had died very, very suddenly, very unexpectedly. And Ken Gott knew he'd never grieved the loss of that baby. And he knew it was like a big blockage in his life. And he referred to that blockage as being like the kings in the cave. That he knew there was something in a cave in his heart, and he'd rolled a stone over it and he said, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to touch that. But one day the Father graciously and lovingly took him back, if you like, to that event of losing that child, painful event of losing that child. And it was actually what Ken knew he had to do was he had to go and sit at the graveside of his little baby boy who died many, many years before. And as he sat at that graveside, he knew what he was doing was he was rolling the stone away from the cave, and he was bringing the king out and dealing with the king. And of course, you know, that's in a way, it was a parallel story to my own journey. But I knew that I had a king in a cave, and I rolled a stone over the entrance to the cave, and I'd left it and I tried to ignore it and pretend it wasn't there. But I knew that there was always something that was holding me back and preventing me from living in the fullness of the life that the Father had for me. And it was on that night in 2002 that I rolled the stone back away from the doorway of the cave, and I dealt with an issue. And I was led into freedom. And you see, what very often happens in our lives is we feel like we have won the battle, but we know we haven't won the war. And what Joshua had to do, he'd won the war, but what he had to do in order to win the battle was he had to come back and deal with the kings. See, the kings always speak significantly of those that are in control. You know, kings rule, they have authority, they have government, they have a rulership and a control. And these kings that we're looking at tonight, that we've pushed into a cave in our heart and we've rolled a stone over, they're still kings. They still have authority over us, negative authority over us. They still rule, and they still affect who we are and how we live. And you know, we might feel like we win little wars, little battles along the way, but if we're going to ultimately win the war, we've got to deal with these kings. We've got to deal with the things that are hidden yet have control over us. Because as we do, we are set free from that control that they have over us. We're set free from that misplaced authority they have in our lives, and we're free to step into a greater level of sonship, and we're free to step into an authority of sonship that we have never experienced before. And you know, I knew that night, and I've seen so many times over the years, that what we actually do in our heart is we leave the king in the cave. You know, we know in a sense that they can't do too much damage to us because there's a stone rolled in front of the cave and they're shut away. But the point is, they are still there. And they can still control, and they can still have an influence and an impact on our lives. You see, what we do is we deal with the things that are on the surface, but very often we don't deal with the root cause. Sometimes we may not know what the root cause is. Sometimes we know too well what it is, but we just know it's too difficult and too hard to go back to. You know, maybe we feel that these things are too overwhelming, and that's why we leave them in the cave. And we feel like we're controlling them because we've hidden them away and we've put a stone in front of the cave door so they can't get out. And we feel like we are in charge. We feel like we have got control and dominion of the situation. And it's okay because that stone is in front of the cave and they can't get out. But the point is, they might be in a cave, there might be a stone in front of the cave, but they're still there. And while they're still there, they do affect us. And, you know, my encouragement for us this evening, what I want to invite you to look at is your own heart. And just to ask the question and say, Father, are there any kings that I've buried away in my life? I put a stone in front of the cave, but Father, are there any kings in my life that you want me to deal with? And then, you know, sometimes sometimes we know all too well what they are, but sometimes we have to ask the Holy Spirit and say, Holy Spirit, what are these kings? You know, if you know that you're held back, if you feel like there is a chain wrapped around your ankle that is attached to a stake in the ground, and you know that you're prevented from moving forward, that's probably because you've got a king stuck in the cave. And, you know, sometimes we know what that is. Other times we need the Holy Spirit to shine his light on it and show us what that king is, so that we can roll a stone away and we can bring that king out and we can deal with it. You see, because when we deal with it, we take authority over it and we enter into this level of freedom. And, you know, I tell you, my life changed that night in Toronto. I knew that I dealt with something that had been there for 30 years, but I knew that I'd stepped into and was free to explore and go deeper in this revelation of God being a father to me and me living loved. You know, previously I'd seen something, but I could never get to it because I was always held back. And what the Father did that night was he cut the chain. He actually undid it from my ankle. I don't have it there anymore. And, you know, he set me free to explore the height and the depth and the width and the length of his love for me. And I want to encourage you, and it may, you know, we'll maybe at the end of this session, we'll put a bit of music on and we'll have a few moments just to ask that question. Are there any kings in the cave? But it may be something you need to unpack over the next few days. It may be something you need to sit quietly with and say, Father, what is it? What is that king in my life? What is that thing that I've hidden away? What is that thing that I've never really dealt with? And then let him lead you with his love and with his grace to deal with that king so that you can walk into freedom. See, this sounds like it could be very, very overwhelming. But I just want to read John 16, verse 33, where Jesus says, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. See, that's just a beautiful encouragement for us as we begin to look at these kings in the cave. Because if we think we have to deal with them in our own strength, we will be overwhelmed. But we have this promise, we have this encouragement that Jesus has overcome. He is our overcomer. He has done for you and me what we were unable to do for ourselves. And he says, I've told you these things so that in me, our lives are hidden in him, so that it's as our lives become rooted and grounded in him, and as he is rooted and grounded in the Father, that is a place of peace and security for us. He said, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. Yes, you will have trouble. And, don't we know that? In this world, there is plenty of trouble. I mean, there's trouble, we see the trouble in our own heart. We see the trouble in our families. We see the trouble in our workplaces. We see the trouble in our churches. We see the trouble in our communities. We see the trouble in our governments. We see the trouble on the world stage. Yes, this world is full of trouble. And it's very, it can be very, very disheartening. But Jesus says, yes, there is going to be trouble, but take heart. I've overcome the world. And that leads us to a place of rest and a place of peace. And I really want to just very simply encourage you that as you begin to look at these kings that have been buried in the cave of your heart, as you begin to roll the stone away and let those kings out so that you can deal with them once and for all, I just want to encourage you that it's not something you have to do in your own strength, because he is our overcomer. See, that night when I brought the kings out of my cave, I didn't do anything. I just sat there crying. And I couldn't stop crying. I had this young guy, just 18 years old, putting his arm around me, not saying a word. I guess he was praying quietly. I don't know. But I knew when it had finished, I was free and God had done something in my heart. You see, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't get out to the front to get to the ministry line. I didn't even ask this guy sitting next to me if he would pray with me. I was rooted to my seat, just letting it go. But you see, I didn't have to do anything because God the Father did it all for me. And yes, when we look at these kings in the cave of our heart, it might feel and look overwhelming. And it will be overwhelming if we have to deal with those in our own strength. But if we recognize and trust that he is our overcomer, that he's overcome the world, he's overcome the troubles of our heart, then that will lead us into a place of peace and rest and security and trust in our Father. You see, when we try and trust in ourselves, it doesn't end very prettily, because actually we're up against something quite big sometimes with these kings. And if we try and fight them on our own, it's just going to be hard work. But the Father says, rest in my overcoming and let me deal with it. There's a verse I often quote, which is in Job 36, verse 16. And it's one of those little known verses, but it speaks volumes of what the Father wants to do for us. And it says this, it says, he is wooing you from the jaws of distress to a spacious place, free from restriction, to the comfort of your table, laden with good food. See, wooing is a word that is wrapped up in love. When you woo someone, you want to draw them towards you. You want to draw them to yourself, but it's actually love that is drawing them to you. And what Job is saying, and he's quoting what God is doing for us, is that God, our Father, is is wooing us. You know, he's drawing us with his love. He's drawing us with his love and by his love away from the jaws of distress. And he's drawing us to a spacious place which is free from restriction. And it's interesting to note that in this place that is free from restriction, free from the jaws of distress, we're led to a table that is laden with good food. And we read that it's a place of comfort. It's the comfort of your table laden with choice food. See, that's the place the Father wants to take us. He wants to draw us away from our distress and our anguish, from the kings in our cave. He wants to draw us away from that, and he wants to set us in a place of freedom, in a place of comfort. And it's like seated at a table full of good food. You know, where have we read that in something much, much more familiar? Psalm 23 verse 5. I prepare a table for you in the midst of your enemies. See, our Father's preparing a good place for us. A place of comfort, a place of provision. And that place, as the psalmist writes, that place of comfort and that place of provision is in the midst of our enemies. You know, it's not locked away in a dining room in a castle. It's a table set before us, put in front of us, with our enemies all around us. Now, I mean, come on. You know, how many of us would sit down at a table to eat a feast when all of our enemies were behind us? You know, we'd be kind of looking over our shoulder as, you know, what was going to be happening and what was going on. But the psalmist writes and Job writes that we have this place of safety. And the reason we can sit in the midst of our enemies is because God is our shield and refuge. He is our protector. And, you know, he is the one that is dealing with the enemies while we can feast at this table that is set before us. You know, he takes the concern and the weight and the pressure of the enemies off us so we can enjoy the provision that is spread in front of us. You know, he deals with the enemies and we get to enjoy the banquet. And it's a place of comfort. It's a place of freedom. See, when I talk about dealing with these kings that we've buried in the cave, we've rolled the stone over, and as we begin to roll that stone away, and as we begin to let those kings out of the cave, we have the security and the peace of knowing that he is leading us with his love. He's wooing us to this very, very safe place. And the beauty is that he's dealing with the fight and we get to eat the banquet. And as you face those kings in your own heart, in one sense, I don't want you to look at the kings. I want you to look at the provision that the Father is setting in front of you and let him deal with those kings. That's what the psalmist says, that the table is prepared in the midst of our enemies. And he wants to lead us to this place of comfort and provision where it might be a place of comfort and provision in the midst of our distress, but it's a place that will lead us into freedom. Again, there's a similar verse, a little bit, it's slightly similar. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And in most of the translations, like the New International or the English Standard or the New American Standard, Paul is quoted as saying, "You are not restricted, but you live as if your lives are restricted." It's like, Paul is saying there is no restriction on you, but you live as if there's a restriction on you. But the message kind of puts it very differently. And in some ways, it's a little bit of a stretch, of translation or paraphrase or whatever. But for me, it kind of like really says very, very clearly what we've been talking about, up till now. And it's 2 Corinthians 6, 11 and 12. And the message says, dear Corinthians, I can't tell you how much I long for you to enter this wide, open, spacious life. We didn't fence you in. The smallness you feel comes from within you. But your lives aren't small, yet you're living them in a small way. And I think just what I want to draw out of that very, very simply, and it does go back to the more conventional translations of being restricted or feeling restricted, but actually we're not really restricted, but we live as if we are. For me, when I dealt with the kings in the cave, I knew that I was entering a wide open, spacious life. It wasn't so much that there was a fence in front of me, it was just like I felt like I was chained to something behind me. And I knew that when I dealt with those kings in my heart, and when I allowed God to deal with those kings in my heart, once and for all, I knew that I was free to enter the wide open, spacious life that the Father has for each one of us. See, we feel as if our lives are small and restricted because we're actually being held back by the power and the authority that these kings are exercising over us. But when we deal with those kings, their power and their authority over us ceases, and we are set free to enter this beautiful, wide open space that the Father has for us. And really my encouragement is, it might be painful dealing with the kings, but there is a promise of fruitfulness and freedom because we will enter the wide open space. And I want to give you one other bit of encouragement, and that is that when you deal with the kings, or when the Father deals with the kings, he deals with them once and for all. Joshua put those kings to death, and they could no longer have any power or authority over anyone. Joshua didn't put them in prison. He didn't send them into exile. He killed them. And when you look at the kings that are holding, that have been locked in the cave of your heart, when you look at these kings, the Father is putting them to death once and for all, so they have no impact or hold on your life. So you are free to be free. I think this is exciting because I know from my own life, my own journey, this was something so clear and so important for me. And actually, this is the first time I've ever spoken about it. I wrote about it on my new website over the weekend, but this is the first time I've spoken and talked about the kings in the cave. But I'm talking about it because I believe the Father wants to set you free. And he wants to set you free from things that maybe have had a hold on your life for many years. And, you never really understood why that's been, but it's because there's been something locked away in your heart that shouldn't be there, that doesn't need to be there anymore. And that's why, in a sense, when we finish the webcast, we can take a few moments, but it might not be enough. It might need more. It might need you to give some time to this, to just to let the Father do what he wants to do. But I want to finish with a very well-known passage from Matthew chapter 11, verses 25 to 30. Jesus says, "No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." And then Jesus says, "Therefore, come. Therefore come. You see, Jesus wants to reveal the Father to us. And, he starts off by saying, Father, I thank you that you've hidden these things from the wise and learned and you've revealed them to little children. But you see, for us, the revelation of the Father will lead, as we come to him with a childlike heart, the inevitable consequence and result of that will be a revelation of the Father. Because that's what Jesus is talking about. He says, no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Therefore, come. Come and let me give you a revelation of the Father. Let me show you who the Father is. Let me show you what the Father's like. But he says the only way you can come is when you have a childlike heart. If you are wise and learned, you will be unable to come. But everything in Jesus is saying, I want you to see the Father. I want the Father to be revealed to you. But in order for that revelation to happen, you've got to have a childlike heart. And as we come as a child, Jesus says, our burden will be lifted. Instead of wearing an ill-fitting yoke, we will wear a yoke that is a yoke of relationship with the Father that is light and easy to wear, easy to bear. It will be a journey that takes us along a pathway of rest. We will find rest for our souls, says Jesus. And I want to read it out of the Message because this is where I get the words living freely and lightly from. You see, because it's the revelation of the Father that leads us into this life of being able to live freely and lightly. There is no other way. It is the inevitable consequence of living in love and allowing God to be a Father to us that we will live freely and lightly. It's the only way, Jesus says. Jesus says, I'm revealing the Father, therefore come. And the consequences of coming are that we will live freely and lightly. And so let me just read these verses from the Message, verses 28 to 30. Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. And that's what I want for my own life. That's what I want for you. I want to live freely and lightly. I want you to live freely and lightly. And the key, Jesus says, is to come and to know the Father, to experience being loved. You see, I know that since I dealt with that king who'd been hiding in a cave, I know that I've been living freely and lightly. There may be other kings that are lurking there. There probably are, but as I deal with them, I know that I'm released into more freedom and this living freely and lightly that I believe we all desire. And so I believe it's in our hearts. I believe it's in our hearts. We want to live freely and lightly. And we don't want anything heavy or ill-fitting. We want to walk with him and watch how he does it. We want to take a real rest. We want to get away with him and recover our life. But sometimes we know that there are those things holding us back. And however much we desire to move on and go deeper, we know there's something holding us back. And tonight I want to give you the opportunity just for a few moments just to ask the Father, are there any kings lurking in a cave in my heart that I've locked away but you want to deal with? Give him permission to bring the kings out of the cave that's the step we have to take. We have to give him permission. Give him permission to roll a stone away, get those kings out, and let him deal with them once and for all. And as he deals with them, his promise to us is that we will begin to live freely and lightly. So I'm just going to put some music on for a few moments and just invite us to just begin to ask that question. And as I said, we may get a revelation in the next few moments. We may need to take more time on it. But I'm just going to finish the webcast now. I'll leave the music on for a few moments. We'll be back again next week. But if you know you've got a king in a cave, maybe it's time to deal with it today. Maybe it's time to let the Father deal with it. And for you to trust that you will begin to live freely and lightly. So bless you. Father, thank you that you are a God of freedom. Father, thank you that you want us to live freely and lightly. Thank you that you want us to walk with you as a child walks with a father. That you want to be a father to us. That we can experience you being a father to us. And so, Father, I just ask if we've got any kings lurking in caves, that with your help and the power of your Spirit, that, Father, you would bring those kings out of the cave this evening and you would deal with them once and for all, so that our hearts would be set free to explore and live in this wide open space that you've set before us. Father, will you set us free from the jaws of distress and bring us to a place of comfort, to a table laden with choice food. Father, where we feel that our lives are restricted, Father, will you take those restrictions off us so that we know the freedom and the joy that is set before us. And Father, as we perhaps begin to look at some issues that are painful in our hearts, would you surround our hearts with your comfort and hold us in your arms and lead us gently as a shepherd would carry a lamb. So, Father, would you carry us gently through this process of healing and restoration in order that we would be set free to walk as Jesus walked, in the glory and the freedom of sonship. Amen.